Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at 1 Peter chapter 3.
Yeah.
Which is...
very interesting chapter.
It really is. We're talking about marriage and persecution all in, like, the short little space.
An interesting combination.
It is. Like, what does that even...
Right.
Like, how do those two even go together?
Yeah.
But, so I think that's what makes it so interesting to deep dive into.
It's a very practical chapter.
It is really practical. And I think that's something that a lot of people who... read the Bible, maybe don't expect all the time.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into that.
Absolutely.
So the first section focuses on wives and husbands.
Right.
And I have to admit, some of these verses can be
a little controversial.
A little bit controversial.
Yeah.
Especially for a modern audience.
Absolutely.
Like starting right out of the gate, verses 1 and 2 are talking about wives being subject to their husbands.
Right.
And that can definitely raise some eyebrows in our world today.
It does.
It does. And I think it's really important to remember the historical context here.
Absolutely.
We're talking about, household structures and cultural norms that were very, very different from our own.
Right.
But even taking that into consideration, this idea of submission, it can still be a bit...
Loaded word.
Yeah, loaded word. What do you think Peter meant in this context, considering the emphasis on, inner beauty and a gentle spirit?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the passage isn't saying that women are less than men or that they don't have a voice.
Yeah.
It's more about encouraging wives to use their influence in a way that's honoring to God and to their husbands.
Okay.
And the emphasis on inner beauty and a gentle and quiet spirit really underscores that.
Right.
It's about cultivating those qualities that are truly valuable in God's eyes. And I think it's also important to point out that the passage doesn't just give instructions to wives.
No, it doesn't.
It also has a lot to say to husbands. It's a two-way street.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So it's not just about wives submitting to their husbands, but about husbands loving and cherishing their wives.
Okay.
And treating them with respect.
It's interesting that you brought that up, because I think a lot of times people, when they read that,
right,
they kind of start there.
They just focus on the submission part and miss the rest of it.
Exactly. Yeah. So getting into that a little bit more, the text even uses Sarah as an example of a woman who, honored her husband, calling him Lord.
Yeah.
But if we actually go back and look at the stories of Sarah and Abraham, we see a woman who, wasn't afraid to speak her mind.
Oh, absolutely.
She negotiated.
Right.
And even challenged her husband at times.
Yeah, they had a very real relationship.
They did.
Right.
And they weren't always,
It wasn't perfect.
Yeah, it wasn't perfect.
Right.
And it wasn't always like, completely harmonious, but they had a strong partnership.
Absolutely.
So maybe what Peter's getting at here is, less about who's in charge.
Yeah.
And more about recognizing each other's strengths.
Right.
And working together, as a team.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes we get so caught up in these traditional gender roles.
Right.
That we forget that marriage is ultimately about two people coming together.
Yeah.
To support each other.
Yeah.
And to help each other grow.
And to love each other.
And to love each other.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. And, speaking of that, I think it's interesting how, the passage goes on to give instructions to husbands.
Right.
Urging them to treat their wives with consideration as weaker partners.
Yeah.
I think that's another one of those phrases.
That can be a little tricky.
A little tricky to navigate.
Right.
But, and to honor them as fellow heirs of the grace of life.
I mean, that's a huge statement.
It is.
Because at the time, women weren't really seen as equals to men.
Right.
They didn't have the same rights. Right. They didn't have the same opportunities.
Right.
So for Peter to say that husbands should honor their wives as fellow heirs, that was a radical idea.
It really was.
It was basically saying that women are just as important in God's eyes as men are.
It really was revolutionary for that time period.
Absolutely.
And so I think even though, the language can feel a little outdated at times,
right,
I think that the core message about mutual respect and partnership is still incredibly relevant for us today.
Absolutely.
And I think it's just, it's a great example of how even seemingly controversial passages can offer really surprising insights when we dig a little deeper.
Yeah, I think that's true of a lot of Spire.
Yeah.
We can't just take things at face value.
Right.
We have to really dig in
right.
and try to understand the context.
Absolutely.
And the original intent.
Yeah.
And when we do that, we often find that there's a lot more there.
Right.
Than we initially realized.
Than we initially thought. Okay, so we've talked a lot about marriage.
We have.
But this chapter isn't just about marriage advice, is it?
No, it's not.
It goes on to talk about living in harmony with everyone.
Right. Verse 8 calls on all believers to be harmonious, sympathetic, affectionate, compassionate, and humble.
So many good words.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like a recipe for a good life.
It really is.
And it's not just about being nice to people.
Right.
It's about actively doing good.
Right.
And refusing to retaliate when we've been wronged.
You know, I think about, like, what would it even look like to live in a community where everyone actually, like, put these principles into practice?
I mean, it would be amazing, wouldn't it?
I think so.
I think we'd see a lot less conflict.
Yeah.
A lot less division.
Yeah.
A lot more love and compassion.
Yeah.
And understanding.
Imagine if everyone just, like, made the conscious choice to bless others, even when they've been hurt. I mean, I think about, like, my own life.
Yeah.
And, like, how many times I've, you know, wanted to retaliate.
Right.
Or, you know, get back at someone.
It's a natural human reaction.
It is.
But it's not always the best reaction.
No, it's not.
And I think this passage is reminding us that we're called to a higher standard.
Yeah.
We're called to be like Christ.
Right.
Who loved us even when we didn't deserve it.
And forgave us.
And forgave us.
Even though we had wronged him.
Exactly.
So, you know, I think it's a really challenging passage.
It is.
But it's also a really beautiful one.
It is.
Because it's pointing us towards a way of life that is truly transformative.
Absolutely.
And that can bring about real healing and reconciliation in our relationships and in our communities.
And in the world.
And in the world.
Yeah.
And then right after all of that, you know, he kind of throws in this little piece of advice about keeping our tongues from evil and deceit.
Right.
Like, it seems like such a small thing.
Yeah.
Compared to, like, everything else we've been talking about.
But it's not.
It's not, though.
No, it's not.
Like, Peter really hammers this point home.
He does.
About watching our words.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Because our words have power.
They do?
They can build people up or they can tear them down.
Right.
They can spread truth or they can spread lies.
And it's not just the big things, you know? It's the little things, too.
It is.
Like the snide remarks.
Right.
The gossip.
The negativity.
It all adds up.
It does. You know, I think about that saying, you know, sticks and stones may break my bones.
Right.
But words will never hurt me.
Yeah.
But, like, that's so not true.
No, it's not.
Words can hurt.
They can hurt deeply.
Deeply
and
hurt.
they can also heal.
Yes.
Right.
So I think, you know, this whole section about, like, watching our words is just a good reminder that even small words can have big consequences.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about marriage.
Right.
We've talked about living in harmony.
But then the chapter takes a bit of a turn.
It does.
And it starts to address this really heavy topic of suffering for doing good.
Yeah. This is where the rubber meets the road.
It really is.
You know, because up until now we've been talking about these kind of idealistic concepts.
Right.
Like love and harmony.
Right.
But the reality is that following Jesus isn't always easy.
Yeah.
And sometimes it comes at a cost.
It does.
And sometimes that cost is suffering.
Yeah.
And Peter doesn't shy away from that.
No,
he actually leans into it.
Yeah.
And he says, you know, listen, if you're going to follow Jesus, you need to be prepared to suffer.
And he's not just saying that, like, you know, hypothetically, like he's writing to a specific audience.
Right. These are people who are already experiencing persecution for their faith.
And so it's like he's coming alongside them and saying, like, hey,
I know this is hard.
I know this is hard, but
it's worth it.
But, like, don't give up. Like, you know, this is part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus.
Absolutely.
And so he's not trying to sugarcoat it or make it sound like it's going to be easy.
Right.
But he is offering them hope.
Yeah.
And encouragement.
And a way forward.
And a way forward.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to get into.
That's what we're going to dive into.
For the next section.
Absolutely.
So thank you for listening.
Yeah, this has been great.
And we will see you next time.
See you then. Yeah, so, like, picking up where we left off.
Yeah.
Peter is really addressing this.
Like, head on.
Yeah, this idea of, like, suffering for doing good.
Yeah, and it's not just acknowledging it. You know, it's like offering guidance on how to actually handle those situations.
Absolutely.
You know, how to actually, like, live this out.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things that he emphasizes is this idea of setting Christ apart as Lord in your hearts.
Okay. What does that look like?
Yeah, what does that actually mean?
Especially when things get tough.
Right, because it's easy to say that, Jesus is Lord when everything's going well.
Mm-hmm.
But what about when you're facing persecution?
Right, when you're being ridiculed.
Yeah, or when you're being threatened.
When you're being, harmed.
Exactly.
For your beliefs.
Right. So I think what Peter is saying here is that you need to have such a deep conviction that Jesus is Lord, that even when you're facing those difficult circumstances, your faith doesn't waver.
Okay.
You don't compromise your beliefs just to avoid suffering.
And it's interesting, too, because he also says, be ready to explain your hope to others.
Right. Always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have.
But he's not saying, go out there and, shove your beliefs down people's throats.
No, it's not about being aggressive or argumentative.
It's not.
It's about being gentle.
Okay.
And respectful.
Even when people disagree with you.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that I really appreciate about this passage.
Yeah.
Is that it emphasizes the importance of dialogue.
Okay.
We're not called to just isolate ourselves from the world.
Right.
We're called to engage with the world.
Yeah, and to share our faith.
Right. But to do it in a way that's loving and respectful.
And that honors the other person.
Absolutely.
Even if we don't agree with them.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a tall order.
It is.
It is.
But it's what we're called to do.
Okay, so up to this point, we've kind of covered, instructions on marriage, advice on harmonious living, guidance on facing opposition.
Yeah.
But now we're moving into what feels like the theological heart.
Yeah. This is where it gets really interesting.
It does.
And a little bit complex.
Or the passage.
Yeah. So buckle up.
Yeah.
We're going deep.
Okay. So verses 18 and 19.
Right.
Talk about Jesus preaching to the spirits in prison.
Yeah. This is one of those passages that has been debated and discussed for centuries.
The spirits in prison.
Yeah, it's a bit of a head scratcher.
What is that even talking about?
Well, there are a lot of different interpretations.
Oh, okay.
But I think one of the most common ones
is
that it's referring to the time between Jesus' death and resurrection.
Okay.
When he descended into Hades and proclaimed his victory over death.
To those who were disobedient in the time of Noah.
Right. So basically he's giving them a second chance.
A second chance.
Yeah.
To repent and believe in him.
Right. Because remember, in the story of Noah,
yeah,
God destroyed the world with a flood.
Because of their wickedness.
Right. Because of their wickedness.
And so Noah and his family were the only ones who were saved.
Exactly.
So I guess what Peter's saying here is that even those who were disobedient in the past have an opportunity to be saved.
Right. Through faith in Jesus.
And then he connects this to baptism.
Right. He says that baptism now saves us.
Not as a removal of dirt from the body.
Yeah, it's not about outward cleansing.
Okay.
It's about an inward transformation.
A change of heart.
A change of heart.
Okay.
A pledge to God.
Of a good conscience.
Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Okay, so how does all of this tie into, the main point of the chapter?
Right, like what's the takeaway for us today?
How does understanding Jesus' suffering and his descent into Hades and baptism.
Yeah.
Like, how does all of this give us hope and courage?
Well, I think one of the main takeaways is that no matter what we're going through, we're not alone.
Okay.
Jesus has been there.
Yeah.
He's experienced suffering.
He has.
He's experienced death.
And he's overcome it.
And he's overcome it.
And so because of that, we can have hope.
We can have hope.
That we too can overcome whatever challenges we face.
Absolutely. And I think another takeaway is that baptism is a powerful symbol of our new life in Christ. It's a reminder that we've been cleansed from our sins.
And that we've been raised to new life.
Right. Just as Jesus was raised from the dead.
And so we can live with confidence.
Yeah.
And purpose.
Knowing that we're not alone.
And that ultimately we have a hope that cannot be shaken.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Yeah.
A hope that cannot be shaken.
That's powerful.
It is.
And it's something that we all need.
We do.
Especially in the world that we live in today.
Especially in the world that we live in today. Yeah. Okay, so as we kind of wrap up this section, I want to point out this really interesting verse.
Okay.
Verse 22. Yeah. Which describes Jesus ascending into heaven.
Right.
At the right hand of God. With angels and authorities and powers subject to him.
Yeah, it's like a grand finale.
It is.
It's a cosmic victory lap.
It is.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
What does that image convey to you?
I think it's a powerful reminder that Jesus is in control. He's not just some distant figure who's off in heaven somewhere.
He's actively involved in our lives.
He's actively involved in our lives.
And he's reigning over all things.
And he's ultimately going to win.
He is.
You know?
And that gives me a lot of hope.
Me too.
Because it means that no matter what happens in this world, no matter how bad things get, ultimately good is going to triumph over evil.
Absolutely.
And that's something worth celebrating.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff in this section.
We have.
You know, suffering, death.
Baptism.
Yeah. But I think it's important to remember that this chapter is ultimately a message of hope.
It is.
It's a message of encouragement. It's a message of resilience.
Absolutely.
And it's a message that we can all hold on to.
Yeah.
No matter what we're going through.
No matter what.
So thank you for listening.
Thanks for joining us.
And we will see you in the next section.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, you know, one of the things that we haven't really touched on yet is this idea of inheriting a blessing.
Right. It's mentioned a couple of times.
Yeah. Like in verse 9.
Yeah.
It says that we've been called to inherit a blessing.
And it's kind of like, okay.
Yeah. Like, what does that even mean?
Like, how do we...
What does that look like practically?
Yeah.
Right.
What do you think Peter is getting at there?
Well, I think it's about living in a way that's pleasing to God.
Okay.
You know, following his commands, loving our neighbor.
Seeking justice.
Seeking justice.
Seeking justice.
Being merciful.
Being merciful.
You know, all of those things.
Right. And when we do those things, we experience God's blessing in our lives.
And so it's not just about like, you know, getting stuff.
No, it's not about material wealth or prosperity.
It's not.
It's about something much deeper.
Yeah.
It's about experiencing God's peace.
His joy.
His joy.
His love.
Yeah.
In a way that's like truly transformative.
And I think, you know, this whole chapter has really been about that.
Yeah. It's about living a life that's worthy of the calling that we've received.
And it's a high calling.
It is.
But it's also an incredibly rewarding one.
Absolutely.
You know, so I think as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge.
Okay.
You know, if we're called to inherit a blessing, what are the specific ways that we can be a blessing to others in our daily lives?
Good question.
You know, even amidst challenges and opposition.
Yeah, because let's face it.
Yeah.
Life is hard.
Life is hard.
And there's always going to be challenges.
Yeah.
There's always going to be opposition.
But I think, you know, even in the midst of that, we can still choose to be a blessing.
We can.
You know, we can still choose to show love.
Yeah.
And kindness.
And compassion.
To those around us.
To those around us.
And I think when we do that, we not only bless others, we bless ourselves.
We bless ourselves.
You know?
Yeah, it's a win-win.
It really is.
So, yeah, I would just encourage our listeners to really think about that this week.
Yeah.
You know, how can you be a blessing to someone else?
How can you make a difference in someone's life?
Yeah, even if it's just a small thing.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be anything big or grand.
No, just a simple act of kindness.
Yeah.
Can go a long way.
It can make someone's day.
It can.
You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, let's all go out there.
Let's do it.
And be a blessing.
And inherit that blessing.
This has been such a great deep dive.
It has.
I always learn so much from you.
I learn from you too.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's so important to really take the time to like dig into the scriptures.
Absolutely.
And to like really wrestle with these ideas.
Yeah, because they're not always easy.
They're not.
But they're always worth it.
They are.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we hope you'll join us again next time.
For another deep dive.
We'll see you then.
Bye.